You went camping alone. A storm rolled in that you were not expecting. But what really has you unsettled is the faint silhouette standing just outside your tent. It's been there for the past hour. You've been too afraid to move, almost too afraid to breathe. Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. These are allegedly true scary camping stories. So enjoy and don't forget to like, share and subscribe. The Man on the Mountain from Huck, Finn Location, Washington. It was the early summer of my senior year of high school. I had just turned 17 and my girlfriend Julie and I had planned a camping trip with some of our friends to celebrate. We were going to be spending the night on Silver Star Mountain, a short drive of where we all lived. We started the day by packing all of the food and cooking materials into my friend's minivan. Then we drove over to pick up the 4 friends that would be joining us, James, Marco, Ferris and Sophia. They all pushed their large backpacks into the van, and we were on our way after about an hour's drive on the highway and another 45 minutes on a narrow dirt road. We made it to the remote trailhead at this point. It was in the mid-afternoon, which was a bit later than we had intended to arrive due to a much-needed river swim. We had taken on the drive up, we quickly started our ascent, and soon realized this hike was going to be much harder than we anticipated. While we were all very experienced hikers, we had not prepared for how steep the trail was going to be. No matter, we pushed on, and after 2 hours of straight uphill climb, we came to a juncture on the trail that was not on the map. After a bit of deliberation, it was decided that I would run up one of the trails and attempt to decipher if it was the right path. I dropped my pack and started to jog up the trail, watching my friends slowly disappear behind me. After a few minutes, I came to the conclusion that this trail was the wrong way. It was a dead end. I had stopped in a small clearing with tall bushes looming above me. I was catching my breath when I noticed that a spot in the grass had been flattened, likely by a large deer or a goat. Just then I heard a rustling to my right. It was in the foliage. I could tell that a reasonably large animal was running off into the woods. After that, I was left in utter and unnatural silence. It was time to get going back to my friends. I ran down the trail, putting the unusual experience out of my mind. We all picked up our bags when I made it back and resumed our hike, eventually making it to the top of the mountain around 6 p.m. For an avid hiker, I can say I've seen some extremely beautiful views, but the top of this mountain was the most impressive. It had a 360-degree view of the horizon all around us, with forest stretching as far as the eye could see. The place where we were setting up camp was on the peak of the mountains, surrounded by sheer rocky drop-offs. Since we saw the sun slowly creeping towards the horizon, we put up our tents and hammocks. After a period of time, we were able to build a fire in the stinging cold wind. We ate dinner, and then James, Sophia, Ferris and Marco went off to smoke a joint on the cliff edge. Julie and I had decided to stay sober the whole trip. We wanted to fully experience everything here. The sun finally set, allowing us to see the most beautiful sunset of my life. James, Sophia, Ferris and Marco crawled into their hammocks, which were about 100 aft from the tent that Julie and I were sharing. After a while of shivering in the cold, I drifted off to sleep with my girlfriend in my arms. I woke up in the middle of the night. I grabbed my phone and looked at it to see that it was 3:0 AM. I nestled back into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes. When I realized why I had woken up, there was a faint cry in the distance. A woman's cry, but I soon realized that it sounded more like a man's whimpering somewhere just outside the tent. I immediately assumed it was James. It was only his second time smoking weed, and for some reason I thought he may have been having a bad trip without thinking. I left Julie in the tent to go help James out and make sure he was okay. I followed the soft crying to the edge of one of the surrounding cliffs, and I looked down over the edge. I saw a figure crouched into an outcropping on the cliff face. He appeared to be weeping James. I yelled out, "Hey, everything all right?" I was still assuming it was him, but there was no reply. Then I decided to do something that I wish I never had. I began to descend the cliff to help him. After about 30 seconds of shuffling down the cliff, I looked again down toward the figure. I noticed that James was not wearing his clothes. How did I not notice that? Before I continued to crawl down towards him. When he slowly looked up towards me, I was filled with a thickening dread that sunk into the core of my being when I noticed this was not James. Instead, it was some strange, skinny man curled into a ball. Tears were flowing down his face, and there was a large rock being held in his hands. I watched in horror as he raised the rock with his right hand and quickly brought it down onto his left hand, smashing his fingers. He then let out a deeply pained groan, but he continued to do it over and over, destroying his hand. He then lifted up what remained of his appendage as if to show me what he had done. I'd already frozen up, completely terrified of the man 10F'd in front of me. He took a short, crouched step towards me, still holding what remained of his hand. I began to climb back up the cliff in a panic, kicking rocks and dirt down behind me. Another painful groan was released from the man's mouth. I looked back to see the man who was now uninterested in me, continuing to smash his hand. 2 bets with that, I reached the top of the cliff and yelled for everyone to wake up. I ran towards where everyone was and told them that there was some crazy man on the mountain with us and that we needed to leave. They must have seen the look in my eye because they knew I was not joking. We all began to quickly pack our things when we all began to hear the animalistic screams of pain, followed by the sounds of rocks tumbling down the mountain. With that, we grabbed our bags and ran down the trail, leaving our hammocks and tent behind. No one spoke on the hike down, and every so often we could hear his cries in the distance. Yes, as we descended down the steep trail. After an hour, we could no longer hear the cries, but still none of us spoke. Eventually, we got to our van and discovered the left rear window had been completely shattered with bits of glass hanging off. We quickly piled into the car and drove off, where I recounted to all of them what had happened on the cliff. Despite how disturbed we all were, we all felt lucky to be alive and eventually started making some jokes about how ridiculous it all was. Once we had cell phone service, I called the police and told them what had happened. To my surprise, they took the case very seriously. They did not find a man on that mountain, but they did find a great deal of blood on the cliff face, the very same spot where the man had been. It is now 2 years later. We all are planning on camping up on the mountain again to prove that we can do it despite the excitement that is going along with it. I can't help but feel that this is a very bad idea. Ohio. Being a Boy Scout was a huge part of growing up for me. The small Ohio town I grew up in had little to do in it, aside from walk around and stare at the depressing, empty buildings left over from the industrial past, among a few other local organizations. There was a scout troop. I spent a lot of time with that troop hiking around the dreary local parks, helping the canned food drives and other things like that. While I have troves of nostalgic tales of camping and nights spent sleeping under the bright stars of the country skies, there are a few interspersed memories of unnerving, maybe even horrifying events. A big part of being a scout is doing community service, and my case was no exception. We picked up trash around the woods, installed new park benches, you name it. We did get a certain kick out of doing stuff around the area, and hey, it beats sitting around all day and doing nothing. Most of the work the local parks had for us to do were just grunt work tasks like having us hike out to some beat-up backwoods trail, chopping up some weeds, carrying out trash whatever minute trail maintenance was needed when the park employees had better things to do when I got an email from some local camp manager in late summer, some years ago, requesting our assistance. I was more than happy to organize a small team to go out and help for a day or two, and this job was not unlike the others. We carried in some axes and shovels and got to work on a previously closed old trail, making it look good walkable. Then we packed it all out, but with this particular job, 2 things stood out. One was that none of us had ever been to or even heard of the park. This was odd, as we had been basically everywhere in the region. Second was that they had asked us to hike nearly 7 miles in a fairly long distance, especially with tools. Thankfully, they had offered us some lodging, so we would be camping out provided we could bring a few blankets and the like. No problem, might as well make a fun time out of it. I thought I emailed a reply to the manager who had reached out, and I said we'd be there with a group of 5 and some tools. A week passed by uneventfully like usual. Soon the time came when I was to load up my truck with a shovel and axe, pick up a friend and drive out to nowhere. We didn't have a huge number of participants in our troop at this point, so it was often up to the members to transport themselves or friends to whatever event they were headed to. Anyway, I picked up my friend Lincoln and we set out toward the park. We met up with the one adult who could spare the time to play the role of chaperone. We didn't really need someone to be there for that. But as per policy we had to, We grabbed our packs and tools and sat down the dilapidated gravel trail toward the camp office, 50 yards or so into the tree line. We found ourselves passing under a tall gate formed by several cut and grounded telephone pylons from which hung a beat-up rotting sign that bore hand-carved letter spelling out Camp Kismet. When we made it to the camp office, we had thought we were in the wrong place. The small building was ramshackle and nearly falling apart. Glancing into a window revealed an even worse interior, with scattered boxes of files and papers surrounding a heavily disorganized metal desk lit by a small, dim lamp. We were about to turn around when one of our party noticed a small note on the back side of the building. The note detailed some rather basic directions to the area. We were to work on and stay at the job we had been set up to do was to clear the brush surrounding and growing inside a climbing tower strangely. I knew about the layouts of most of the camps in the area, and I had never known this particular one to have a climbing tower. If it did, it would have been one of the only towers in the region. Regardless, we set forth in the walk out the cabins here were nothing to write home about fairly standard, non-insulated plywood walls and some old surplus cots. The tower, on the other hand, was quite strange. A tall and surprisingly thin structure, and by no means looked fit for use. We noted this and hoped that we weren't brought in to clear out the tower for actual use without any renovations, judging by the state of the tower and the budget most of the camps in the Ohio area could get their hands on. It would be years before it would be anywhere near safe for climbers. Nevertheless, we settled down for the first night, cooked some canned soup on the dented stove in one of the cabins, and laid down on the stained plastic mattresses and that rested upon the squeaky old cots. We were up early the next morning. Breakfast of some bacon and a couple of cans of beans were on the stove by 6. Still not awake, I stepped out onto the somewhat shabby front deck to drink some coffee. I sat down on a nearby plastic lawn chair and exhaled deeply. It was to be a long pair of days in the decaying camp, and if we were to make any progress on this mess of a climbing tower, it would take some hard work crawling back inside to let someone know my intentions. I laced up my boots and began sombering toward the tower. The path there was down another unkempt gravel path that took a wide L shape toward the tower. I was rubbing my eyes as I walked. Still not all the way up. Turning the corner and coming into view of the tower in the near distance, I was instantly awake because ahead 3/4 of the way up the structure was a roughly human-sized shape. It had short limbs like a child and was not making fast time of the side. There was, to my slight relief, a rope attached to the person's waist, but upon further examination, no belair was manning the ropes below in a state of somewhat disbelief. I turned to retrieve some binoculars from my bag, optics in hand. I faced the tower and raised the binoculars, only to see no such being upon the looming wooden structure. Any longer shocked, I replaced the binoculars and began back toward the cabin. I set my mind to be vigilant over the day's work to try and make light of my morning vision back at our camp. I organized the now awake crew into 2 teams. 3 who would work on clearing the brush on the exterior of the tower about 500 FT airway, leaving me and another scout who we called Night to work on the inside shovels, axes, saws and rakes at the ready. We made our way down to the tower as we rounded the bend. I have expected to see another figure on the tower, but fortunately I did not. We arrived at the base of the structure, and each of us set about to our respective tasks. Making my way inside, Night and I were met with a side of extremely thick brush growth. Just to get in the tower, we had to work it with an axe and saw. Once inside, we discovered that brush was not the only thing. At the base of the tower, a large metal filing cabinet and a long metal trunk stood against the wooden walls. The cabinet read permission slips in bold red letters, and the trunk had helmet sharpies on top. Unsurprisingly, we opened both. The helmet's trunk was empty, but the filing cabinet was not. Inside lay 3 folders each dated a year between 1996 and 1996 and 1998, containing permission forms from some past generation of campers. At the back of the drawer, stuck against one of the metal sides, was a yellowing piece of notebook paper. Picking it up, a small piece flaked off and fell to the ground, and began to read aloud with a Night following over my shoulder. "Tom, we got to get on this. The kid's parents are suing. They want to put us away and say we did it, that we're responsible for him. Our only way out is to say he didn't have his papers and got on without us knowing, find that kid's form and get rid of it. If they do painting his death on us, will be a cakewalk Johnson night. And I looked at each other in shock. Our moment of realization was cut short with a creak from the top of the tower and a wispy, nearly inaudible voice. He told us the ropes would keep us safe. We looked up in a near panicked state. Rotting boards from the walls began to fall off 1x1 as creaks up the side of the tower ring out as if someone were making their way up the side. The boards crashed into the ground with crunches and clumps. The sounds of creaking from the wooden structure became deafening until the horrible sounds were all brought to an end by the most grim of all the sound of a heavy object falling through the air, thudding into the ground alongside the crunch of bones, concluding with the soft sound of rope piling up as it fell back down to earth. We hurried out of the tower, thinking someone to be injured, but found no one still shocked. We ran toward the group, desperate for an escape from the grim scene we had just witnessed. We found the crew on their way back towards us. I wheezed out an expletive, and the crew asked, "What was wrong with us?" Knight burst out. "What do you mean? What's wrong?" He turned and waved his arm toward the structure. "Look, the tower is falling apart." The crew had a stunned and confused look on their faces. I turned around and swore aloud as I saw that the tower had no missing boards, no creaking beams, and no fallen climber. After spitting out the explanation, we returned to the cabin and packed our bags. Not one of us, and the whole team, had not experienced something strange like this, and we had come to trust each other. When we finished, we began moving out on the walk back. All of us jumped at our own shadows, especially Knight. We loaded our vehicles with haste and sped off. Since then, I haven't heard from anyone who was involved, except for one email from the same person who sent me the first one. It was a strange thank you for our help, which we never finished. I have never been there again, and I don't think I ever will. The sound of things breaking made me never want to go back to that camp. I shouldn't have kept waiting from British Columbia. The day everything happened was pretty nice. The sun was peeking through the trees, and you could hear an occasional squirrel chattering away. Possible to hear. I've lived my whole life in British Columbia, and nothing strange or unusual has ever happened to me. I'm just that weird, quiet teen who likes to be alone. My guilty pleasure has always been going on long walks by myself when I'm camping. My family and I had gone camping at a nearby lake at this time. People from all over the area come to drink, smoke, catch up with old friends, or meet new ones at horse show tournaments. The lake is called Horseshoe Lake, which is a good name for it. When you leave the lake, you'll be in the Rocky Mountains. From the lake to the mountains can be a long way, but I was only a few miles from the lake when I was hiking. Out there, I could no longer hear my campsite, but that was fine. I was happy to find out that I was on my own. I went for a few miles of fun walks with my hatchet, looking for a good place to sleep or maybe build a fort. I stopped. Once I got to a small clearing, I didn't look around because I was already used to my surroundings. I knew every stone and path like the back of my hand. I laid down against a missy tree for a while and looked up at the sky. I must have fallen asleep because when I woke up, I looked for my hatchet. I grabbed it, rolled over, and rubbed my eyes to wake up. When I finally stood up, I saw that the sun was starting to go down. I was still far from camp, so I started walking back to my fire. I noticed that everything was quiet because I grew up in the woods and know how quiet it is when a place like this is empty. There's something wrong, even if it seems like the opposite. Something is going on with you. I stopped for a while and pressed my ears against the back of my hoodie. When I took my first step, I tripped over a stump because I was looking around so much. I started laughing and told myself I was probably just being silly. I've never had anything bad happen to me, which is why I want to show myself that I was wrong to be afraid. That night, I started walking to camp more slowly, but I was calm and at ease. Now that I think about it, I wish I had moved faster. It was getting darker, and I could smell something bad. I know that cougars like the area a lot. I was afraid that I had found one by mistake. I looked around to see if there were any bone piles or other bones. I couldn't find a clear path, so I'm just walking through bushes and trees. I was starting to worry at this point. I had no light and nothing I could use to protect myself. I remember thinking that I'm doomed if a cat that size is following me. I stop again, and I can feel that someone is watching me. I can't get rid of this stupid feeling. I turn around and just stare at the trees, crossing my fingers and hoping there's nothing there. I keep walking, but I thought that if I stopped looking, something would come out of the darkness and grab me. I finally saw a mark I had made on a tree with my hatchet on the way there. I was close to camp and could hear people talking in the distance. I started running until I heard the sound of what was after me. All this time, my fears were right. I had every reason to run, but I didn't pay attention. No matter how quickly I tried to get back to the campsite, everything seemed slow. I could hear broken sticks in the distance. I didn't care. As fast as I could, I ran. I finally got past the last hatchet mark and ran straight into the camp. I sat down by the campfire and tried to feel safe, but I couldn't. It couldn't have been a bear because bears don't sound like that, and I don't think it was a bobcat or cougar either. I don't know what was in that forest, but I'm glad I woke up when I did. If I had slept another minute, I never would have woken up. The creature in the woods from Will, I live in the USA. K. Just up north, close to where Scotland starts. My parents wanted me to be more active, so they put me in a Boy Scout group, but I was used to being in the woods. My father and grandfather would often take me and my brothers there. We went camping for 7 days farther north. The campsite was small and no one else was there. Ali and I were in a tent together. It was about 6 p.m, and we had just finished setting up our tents. When the sky got dark, we ate dinner and started a campfire around 8:30 or 9 p.m. to roast marshmallows. We were all pretty tired, so we decided to just lay around the fire and look at the stars since there wasn't any light pollution nearby. There were a lot of stars out. When I saw it, it was at this time. Ali and I were talking when he suddenly stopped and asked, "Hey, what's that?" He pointed up to the sky, where he saw a bright red object that looked almost like a bullet, moving quickly in a zigzag pattern. One of the people in charge of us was in the RAF. Since he had been there for 6 years, he knew that no normal human craft could move that way, which was strange but cool. After that, Ali tried to scare me by saying that they were going to eat our brains, which is why we finally went to sleep. So I became even more suspicious. In the middle of the night, at 2 a.m, I woke up. Raindrops were falling lightly on the tent, but there was also a small grunting sound coming from the forest to the left. My heart was racing and I was shaking so hard I was almost crying. I could hear the creature moving slowly past the tents. Next was Simon's. I finally got back to sleep, though it was a scared sleep. The next morning, I pretended to be sick so I could go home, and it worked. When the rest of the group got home, Ali kept talking about something he heard the third night I was gone. Something he said sounded like grunting. I told him that was the real reason I had to leave. Since that day, we've never talked about it again. Ali and I still talk through Discord sometimes, but we've never talked about this again. I still don't know what the strange UFO in the sky was, or what the strange noises were outside my tent. I wonder if there is a link between those two things. I'm not going to tell Anonymous G-Ray something. My age is 25 and I live in Michigan. I went camping by myself near Lake Michigan 5 years ago. It was the first time I did that, because I usually went with someone or my dog. When I went camping, I had to walk about 9 miles to get to where I was staying. It was in a very remote place. I prepared everything. A fire in the tent, and I started to pass the time by reading a book, going for another hike around the area, etc., until I finally came back around nightfall. I tried not to think about the scary darkness around me as I sat by the campfire and heard something strange. I thought it was a deer because it was a really low grunt. He was big, and it was time to go to bed. So I went back to my tent and made sure my gun was right next to me. I got a few hours of sleep, but a more scary sound woke me up from a bad dream. It sounded like something was scratching at the tent. I wish it was a coyote, which is what I first thought it was. I took off my hood and tried to scare it away, but instead of a dog-like shape, I saw a thin grey creature, half as thin as me but twice as tall, disappear into the darkness of the forest. After just standing there for a few minutes, I ran out of the woods and made the whole hike back that night to get to my car and leave Seth's campsite. It was a warm night in July with a cool breeze. For my friend Aiden's birthday, I stayed at his house. Since Miles and Jason were coming over, we set up a tent in the backyard to make it look like we were camping. We could stay up all night without waking anyone up. After all, we could be pretty loud. Aidan told me when I arrived earlier in the day that his chickens have been going missing. So when we were in the tent that night, I thought about what he had said, and it made me a little nervous. I started to think about what could have been making his chickens act that way, but I didn't want a scary time. I wanted a fun time. So I stopped thinking about it and started hanging out with the guys. Later that night, Aidan's younger brother came out to the tent to hang out with us. The fire went out quickly. To see, we had to use our phones or flashlights. But fear and paranoia started creeping back in, and I couldn't tell the other guys because they'd think I was a coward. But I couldn't ignore the sounds I heard coming from outside the tent. It sounded like something was out there walking around. Jason got scared all of a sudden. He wanted to get inside again. In the end, he did. But just in case, we made sure to bring Aidan's little brother along. It was 11 p.m. By then, things were getting worse, which was scary. Only Aidan, Miles and I were there. We had finally found something to do, and we were having fun again, when something hit the tent hard. We were all nervous and scared at that point, and I tried to tell myself that it wasn't strange. By 11:30, things were still going on. The sound of the footsteps kept going, as if something was running through the field nearby. I was getting tired of it, so I told myself I wasn't going to let it hurt me or eat me. I told the others we had to go inside, but they insisted they wanted to walk around outside. Were they crazy or too afraid to go out there by themselves? I couldn't avoid going with them. We left the tent huddled together and shaking. We went to the chicken coops, where we saw something that still scares me to this day. A tall black figure with long claws stood there. We screamed and ran back to the house as fast as we could. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I was ready for that thing to try to get in the house or show up at one of the windows, but it didn't, and I never saw it again. Too close to feel safe. From Bilbo, 1776. When I was 15, my parents sent me to a boarding school. During the first week, we went camping in Glacier National Park in northwestern Montana. We were about 40 people, and we all needed a place to set up our tents. I had brought a triangle-shaped army tent with me. It was too small for more than one person to sleep in, and I had to use a couple of cans of seal end to make it waterproof. Since I was a freshman at the time, I had to help set up the camp, so I was one of the last people to put up my own tent. The good spots in this camp area were taken by the sophomore and junior classes, while the seniors had their own camp. So you know, all of the spots with soft grass or pine needles on the ground have already been taken by the groups I've already mentioned. I had to set up my tent on mostly gravel, which was further from the rest of the campers than anywhere else. When I was done setting up my tent, I put in my flashlight, an M3 player with headphones, my pillow, my sleeping bag, and finally my pocket knife. The first night of the school camping trip was like any other. All of the tents were checked by the school deans and the principal to make sure they were safe. After that, we all worked together to start a fire and get ready for dinner. After that, we had to clean up and make sure that all the food was in bear-proof containers and that everyone's deodorants and soaps that they had brought were also sealed. The next 2 days were fun, and the science teacher and the history teacher gave us a few tasks to do. We then looked around the park. We did, in fact, see quite a few bears. On the other hand, their hibernation period wasn't for a few more months. They looked for food like crazy, but we didn't come close to being eaten. I had grown up in forests, so I was used to all the wild animals. By the third night, things were back to normal. I was going to bed, and because we had been out all day, I fell asleep pretty quickly. I woke up at around 1:30 that night. I didn't know why I was on high alert right away. For whatever reason, I never do that. I always wake up groggy, and it takes me about 20 minutes to get out of bed this time. But something was making me nervous. I listened hard to see if I could hear something that sounded the same. Something that got my attention, but except for a very low wind, there was almost no rustling in the forest and no crickets chirping. As I said before, I grew up exploring the forest and loved walking through it at night, so I held my breath to hear anything. I finally caught on. A hard, heavy breathing seemed to come from right outside the tent walls. The next second, I heard the soft crunch of gravel under a padded foot. I stopped sniffing the air, which was only a few feet away from my tent. I made up my mind, like a stupid teenager. I should have tried to move. Even though the tent was small, It did have a small mosquito-netted window. Thankfully, I had brought my cloth sleeping bag instead of the newer polyester, lined one, which would have been much noisier. I slowly took off the thin, flat fabric that was on top of it. Then I looked out, and what looked like a grizzly bear was less than 10 feet from my tent. It didn't move around much. It just turned its head from side to side and sniffed the air. It seemed to be looking for a certain smell and had to get closer to it before it could move on. I watched the huge beast for a while. When it stood up on its back legs, I could see that it was easily 8 feet tall. It was still sniffing the air. Then it got back up and started walking closer to my tent. It walked right past me, coming within a foot of the side of my tent. I could smell how bad it smelled from where it was. Right there, it stopped again, and my heart almost stopped. As the moonlight fell, it shone around the animal. Then it turned and put its nose up against my tent, as if it wasn't sure if I smelled like what it was looking for or not. I hoped that I wouldn't be. Then, just as quickly as I had woken up, the bear ran away. I hadn't heard any heavy breathing like before as it went, and I didn't hear or see it turn away. It was like its shadow stayed longer than it did to keep me from hearing it leave, because my heart was beating so fast and hard. I thought I was going to go deaf because I could hear my heart beating the whole way until the adrenaline wore off. I fought sleep until it was almost light, and then I fell asleep until one of my classmates woke me up by kicking the tent with his foot. I muttered an insult. He laughed at me and said something about how hard I was sleeping. Then he left. He had no idea. The last 2 nights were uneventful, but I still had trouble sleeping because I was afraid the bear would come back, knowing that he was looking for me, this man from LA. I was 24. We both wanted to go camping, so we decided to go together. We spent the day canoeing, fishing, and doing other fun things, but I couldn't help but notice that my boyfriend was acting a little strange. At about 12:30 a.m., he seemed worried, but I never asked why. We were finally going to sleep in our tent, so we got into our pajamas and double sleeping bags and closed our eyes. I couldn't sleep because the tent was really cold and damp, and the wind outside was too loud. After an hour or two, I finally turned around to face my boyfriend and changed my position to something more comfortable. But when I saw someone else's face instead of my boyfriend's, I was so scared I couldn't move. It was the head of a person, but the face was blank and didn't look like a man's face. There was only flesh and skin that were flat like an egg. I almost screamed when I jumped up. But when my boyfriend got up, he started to wonder what was wrong with me. When I looked at the sleeping bag, there was no face. It was a terrifying thing to go through, and I know I was awake. I was scared that night. It's hard to explain how anonymous felt when a ghost showed up at a school camp. This happened when I was camping with other fourth-year students in my secondary vocational education program. I have always been interested in and aware of ghosts and spirits, even when I was a small child. I was really interested in strange things. I think it was something my mother taught me to love. So let's get to the story. All fourth graders went camping, and on the last night, when my class got to sleep in tents outside, we all decided to do so. As the night went on, the teachers went to bed, and as a group, we all started to feel uneasy, like we were all afraid. Just before we all decided to go to bed, too, I felt a familiar chill go up my spine. It was a feeling I had always thought would happen when ghosts were nearby. But this one wasn't like the others. Something wasn't right. At about 8 a.m., I saw a group of classmates coming toward me who I knew believed in ghosts. Their eyes got very big. No one had ever been so pale before. One of them told me what he had seen the previous night. He said that night he saw a soldier in a uniform that looked like it was from the early 1900s walking around the campsite and stopping every so often to look at the kids on the ground. He said he was so scared he couldn't move, and when he saw the soldier's figure just swaying in the wind, he almost lost consciousness. Even after we left that campsite, I still felt that horrible, icy cold. I was afraid that something would show itself to me at any time. At that campsite, there was something that stuck to me. Even now, I sometimes feel a random chill go up my spine, like an echo that is only there to remind me of the terrible things that happened at that campsite. I never want to go back to anonymous bathroom ghosts. My father and I used to camp in the Catskills. We took down the tent and packed up the car after a fun weekend, but before we left, I had to go to the bathroom. Even though I was still young, Even though we were at a campsite in the woods, and it was the middle of the day, I didn't want to go to the bathroom outside in front of other people. My dad took me to the campsite's facilities. Then he went back to the car to wait. He said no when I asked him to come with me. I went to the bathroom and went to the one urinal there. There were 2 stalls, a sink, and a urinal in the bathroom. At the time, I was the only one there. I always lowered my head and looked in the stalls when I went to a public bathroom, but I never saw anyone else. I was just about to let go when I heard this sound like someone whispering. Even though no one was in the last stall, the sound was coming from there. I couldn't figure out what language the whispering was in. I finally got too scared, so I didn't say anything and left. I don't know what I heard in there or where it came from, but if it meant I could avoid it, I was happy to be tortured all the way home because my bladder was full. Take a look at this last story, a short extra story. On October 10, 2018, I told this story to a very small crowd, so it's likely that most of you have never heard it. If so, have fun. This is what happens, according to Matilda J., when you wear headphones in the woods. People call me weird or say I'm defeating the point, but when I go hiking or camping, I bring a pair of Sony headphones and my smartphone so I can watch my favorite YouTube channels and maybe some Netflix or Hulu. Sure, I've almost walked into a tree a few times, but when you work 12 hours a day, 4 days a week, it can be hard to find the time. You need to watch some of the videos you like, do your errands, and get outside. The thing is, I haven't worn headphones outside in a year, and I don't think I ever will again because of something so scary that happened to me. I almost didn't go back into the woods again at all. The date was July 7, 2017. Since I was off on Fridays, Saturdays and Sundays, I had planned to go camping that day. It should have been easy and fun. Leave on Friday night, spend Saturday alone in the woods, and come home on Sunday, so I can get enough rest for another 12-hour shift on Monday. By 4:30 p.m. on Friday, you should have left. On that day, I had everything packed and all of my weekend errands done. It was time to go outside and sit by a crackling campfire in the mountains to catch up on an overflowing subscription fee. Nothing ever happens. I live near a highway in the city, so you can imagine how relaxing it is for me to go somewhere where you can hear your ears ringing. I walked for half an hour before I got to my planned campsite, which was a small clearing surrounded by tall conifers. There was shade and lots of wet leaves on the ground, which was perfect for me, so I started to take my pack off and set up my tent. As I was setting up my nylon shelter, I suddenly stopped and felt something strange on the back of my neck. I was counting down in my head, and it felt like I was breathing. 3, 1. I then went back. All I could see was a forest, a quiet, empty forest. I let out a sigh and rubbed the new goosebumps that had appeared on the back of my neck. I then went back to the tent that wasn't finished. That was strange. Was the only thing I could say about it. It was getting dark. By the time the fire was going, it was crackling in front of me, with my back to the trees and the tent on the other side. One headphone was on top of my head, and the other was hanging behind my head. I was finally able to chill out and have fun. On the YouTube app, I went to my subscription feed. Then I started my nighttime binge, which was made possible by bug spray. Dude Perfect was the first one. I can't remember which video it was, but I think I just played it for a while. I was soon pulled away from my subfeed, and I ended up watching videos of people flipping bottles in overly dramatic ways. That's what YouTube is like. Peace didn't last long though. I had been watching videos for about 40 minutes when I was scared, unable to move, and stuck where I was sitting. I thought I was alone in these woods. I hadn't told anyone I was going camping this weekend or invited them out here. So when I felt it, I thought my heart would just melt away. Someone's hands were on my shoulders. I remember when I was scared, I thought, who and why? I remember thinking that I really wished I hadn't turned my back on the woods. Regardless of who owned these hands, they were as cold as ice. Every inch of their dry, cracked skin hurt like a wave of angry red ants. Somehow I couldn't move, or in the back of my mind, I just didn't want to. I knew that if I jumped or turned around quickly, my attacker would be in my line of sight, and I didn't want to see whose hands they were. They crept up over my shoulders and moved down toward my chest. By then, I could see her skin was pale white, and her fingernails were yellow and chipped. They went all the way around the outside of my plaid shirt. Nothing had ever felt so soft, but also so sneaky. At the same time, as it moved over my shivering body, it left goosebumps in its way. Seconds later, I felt something new on the back of my neck. It scared me because it felt like I was breathing, but the air was cold and dry. What must have been 20 seconds lasted for a very long time. Every time my heart beat, it felt like a battering ram hitting my shaky ribcage. What should I have done? What would a person do if they missed their chance to jump out of the way? When they let an unknown thing take control of them in the middle of miles and miles of wilderness? Having a violent shake, I started to move my arms. I slowly picked them up. The headphones on my head were my goal. I thought, I'll get rid of them and then ask the intruder what they wanted from me. Now that I was only a few inches away from my headphones, my heart was beating harder. The red noise of my blood rushing through my veins had now drowned out the sound of the video on my phone. I finally got my hands on my headphones. I told myself that all I had to do was pull them off another countdown. 3, 2, 1. I took the plastic arch off my head and jumped quickly over the campfire. I turned toward where I had rested before. I took a deep breath where I used to sit, but I couldn't get up. Shadows danced in the light of the campfire, and trees in the distance moved very slightly in the light breeze. What? I let out a loud breath. Did I dream it? I tried hard to come up with a reason, but I couldn't. After I stopped denying it, I felt angry as I yelled at myself for wearing headphones in the woods and thinking I was safe. If these headphones hadn't made me deaf, I would have been able to hear the attacker coming into my camp. But the person who attacked was no longer there. Now that I was upset and thinking about cancelling my plans for the weekend, I crawled into my tent and sat facing the small opening, where the fire was still brightly burning. I stayed awake and aware for the next 2 hours because it took me that long to convince myself that what I had just seen was just a dream or something. Yeah, just a hallucination I had because I was tired from a long work week and a dangerous hike. It was made worse by the fact that I was wearing headphones to listen to nonsense on the internet. I was sure there was nothing to worry about, so I didn't worry. I laid back, still looking out the tent's opening at the fire outside. After that, I went back to reading Shane's subfeed. My headphones started to fill up with Dawson. I was warm, at ease, and having fun. It took me only a few minutes to fall asleep. I'm not sure what made me wake up. My right hand was still propping up my phone, which by then was quite far from my subscription feed again. I was probably gone for about an hour. It was still dark outside. In fact, it was getting darker because the fire that used to give my tent warmth and a safe glow had died down to orange glowing embers. It let out some light, but not enough for me to know I wasn't alone. I didn't breathe. If they didn't already know, the sound of me breathing in would tell them. I was there, and there was a small woman sitting on the other side of the campfire from me. Because her dirty, mud-covered hair was hanging in front of her face, she seemed to shake every few seconds. I couldn't see much more than the shape of her kneeling and shaking. From what I could tell, she wasn't wearing any clothes, but the mud on her body had dried and turned into a kind of body paint. Even if she had been looking at me, I wouldn't have known because my headphones were still on. I took them off quietly and then realized that it wasn't as quiet as it seemed. When the girl shook, she let out a raspy moan. All this time, she had been crying. In the middle of the forest, this dirty, strange little girl was crying in my camp. For a moment, my fear went away. I couldn't help but think that this poor girl might need help. Maybe she was the reason I was scared before, and my sudden jump scared her back into the woods, which made me feel bad and scared. I stood up and put my phone and headphones next to me, but as soon as my shoulder rubbed against the side of the tent, her face turned up. She was looking right at me, and I could see her face well in the light of the fire. I yelled. The girl only had eyes. She didn't have a mouth or nose, just eyes that cried all over her face. I started to crawl backwards and hit the tent's back wall. I had to get away from her so badly that I tore a hole in it. I got stuck in the hole by accident, and it took me a while to get out. When I finally did, I was standing outside what was left of the shelter. I turned to look for the girl, but she was gone. She was gone, but her cries could still be heard. They could be heard far away in the trees around me. The crying now sounded like it was a long way away. I couldn't figure out what was going on, and all my mind could make me want to do was run away. So I agreed. I got back to my car without anything else going wrong. Without any more sounds or sights that made me feel like my life was over, all I could feel was relief. There was nothing. After all that, all I wanted to do was go home. I don't need a whole new weekend to get away from this bad one. I looked up as I got into my car and put the keys in the ignition. I didn't see or hear the girl again, so the answer is no. But then I did figure out something. In my hurry, I had left my phone and headphones at home. The remains of my tent were there to show what I had been through. I pushed the gas pedal all the way down and didn't stop until I got home. I haven't planned any more trips into the woods, and the most I've done is hike on already busy hiking trails. One thing I no longer do is wear headphones outside. Call it a nonsensical phobia. But I don't think that's all of it. This should serve as a warning. Be careful if you ever find yourself in the woods with headphones on and listening to something. You're never quite alone. And if you ever find a campsite that was just left and has an old pair of Sony headphones on the ground, turn around and leave. Leave before you hear her crying. So this is the end of the show for today. I hope these reasons didn't make you want to go camping. But if you're like me, there are reasons why I don't go camping as often as I should. I like being scared just as much as the rest of you, but I don't think I'll like being chewed and eaten alive from behind 4 nylon walls. Good night. If you liked this episode, like it, share it, comment on it, and subscribe. Send us your story at darkstories.org if you want it to be read out loud. If you want to support the show, you can donate on Patreon at patreon.com/darknessprevails or look at our merchandise at teespring.com/darknessprevails. As usual, here are my 5 favourite early reactions to the last episode, which was about 3 strange monster attacks in the Appalachians. Spork says, I eat wood. I have an idea for a future video. You should make a list of your favourite and most scary stories about animals. That would be enjoyable. Would I be reading and ranking stories about these creatures or just talking about them? Kane Tuffin says in the comments, my dude, just when I needed you. I tend to put out videos at the right time, that's true. That's because I watch you through the window every second of every day. And yes, I know about that weird mole. Dimitri Vlad says the monsters will make you squeal like a pig. That's why all guys are scared and upset by it as a whole. Ellie Hernan says, I have to go through the Appalachians to get to Ohio this summer. Well, everyone should stand up to honor Ellie Hernan. They were nice people. And Jerica Hacking says I should be writing my paper. But this seems more important, unless you're putting off writing your papers about the Appalachians, you lazy people. When I was in high school, that was my middle name. How the heck did I even finish school? I have no idea. So that's all there is to today's episode. But don't worry, because soon there will be more scary stories. Keep in mind to stay safe and weird, because the world is a strange place.